My name is Sam Katz. I'm a member of Fight Club. I'm in the United States, and I got involved with Fight Club because I enjoy wargamings as a kind of a next level chess. And I've had a couple of ideas on how we can take some existing off the shelf technology and apply some more or less some vibe coding to it and build it into something entirely new that works with existing infrastructure.
Okay, that's great, Sam. Thanks very much for coming on and giving us your time tonight. So we're going to be talking about the application that you've built called Road to War, which if I was to give it a bit of a bottom line up front, I would say it's a force design, force builder with an execution aspect repeated in 5-year cycles. But let me ask you, how would you describe it in a sentence?
Yeah, I would say it's making the decisions that happen before the first deployment even occurs.
Okay, and what is the game system that you've built this to interface with?
It is based in HTML.
Okay, so the application's in HTML, and but just to be clear for the audience, that you've designed effectively a left of game interface, the plan is then it interfaces with a digital simulation.
Correct. The initial design is that it you do the that initial cycle 5 years, and it will generate a Lua-based script that can be copied and pasted for the force design that the player selects, and it goes right into a game called Command Modern Operations.
Hmm. So just to be clear, you haven't edited anything in Command Modern Operations. You've built something outside, and then you have a ability to export a file in a language that the game system understands.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, how long does it take to do that?
To generate this script, it takes about 5 seconds.
Okay, and that's important because I suspect many people watching and listening to this might think it takes a lot of time to convert something outside of a game system to something that works inside of a game system. How have you managed to make it take only 5 seconds?
Uh, I am an avid user of AI, and I use it professionally every day. And I applied the same principles that I use in my professional employment with building this tool and capability. Command's underlying database can be read and integrated, and it's just a question of pointing the LLM at what you want the outcome to be, and then testing it, making sure it works, and then it's good to go.
And did you find Command had a particularly malleable or simple interface with which to work versus other digital systems that are out there?
Command to do something like this manually would probably take several hours. I think there would probably be uh, issues, just small details that were missed, but this allows the player to focus on really that force design and the upstream work versus making sure that they've set up the command scenario properly.
Okay. So rolling it right back, what problem are you trying to solve with the application Road to War?
Yeah, I think that if you think about, there's a lot of contemporary coverage on uh, the changes that are occurring throughout NATO right now. And with Road to War, we kind of roll back the clock into 1980 to an alternative history. And we're allowing players to make those decisions, those trade-offs between different services, the trade-offs between capabilities, and the budget trade-offs, of course, that come with, well, do you want to upgrade? What do you want to upgrade? What do you think the defense priorities are going to be for that next future combat? And then if things change or there is something that's different, it allows the player to test, did they do a good job at building a force that can respond to multiple threats, or did they really miss the mark on trying to specialize in one direction when the threat came from a different direction?
Okay, so do you have an example or a vignette that you could use to just illustrate that a bit more?
Sure. So I think if you look back to just this kind of hypothetical scenario, Turkey leaves NATO in 1981, and one of the potential crisis draws for the UK is a Turkish invasion of Cyprus, and they need to dedicate resources to figure out how they're going to address this threat, given that Turkey is a more or less a U.S. armed ally as of 1980 before they leave NATO, and they're going to be potentially fighting a near-peer adversary.
Okay. Is it possible for us to have a look at the graphical user interface that you've designed with Road to War here?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Can you see my screen?
Not just yet. There you go. Yeah, got it.
Okay. So you start with the map of the UK where the bases are. There's some budget decisions, budget guidelines, breaks out each of the branches, what goes into which bucket. The player can then change the budget allocation by branch. If there are changes, they need to commit to what capability they're or what they're trying to do with it to simulate that kind of political component. It's not a geopolitics game, but I do feel that it's important to have that type of thing in here for the player to consider, hey, you don't just have this blank whiteboard where you can do whatever you want. If you're asking for more money, the political component is going to expect accountability for what is being done. Then there's some just additional budget concerns. So, you can defer maintenance, you can defer infrastructure, probably some of the real life decisions that might be made to try to push more into procurement. You can rebalance some of the funding, and then there's a calculation on what's left. Then the player can make decisions on their forces. So they can make squadron level decisions within aircraft, for example, if they wanted to push them to reserve, they wanted to mothball certain equipment. They can make decisions on base closures, so they could close base and then they would have to figure out what they would do for redeployment. But I think what's really most important and impactful for the player are these programs. So this is where the player can make decisions about what they're trying to do for their force design, where they might want to look at, and I'll focus on Air Force here. So they might want to look at what are their options for improving their intercept capability. They could accelerate the delivery of the Tornado F3. Then they could always pivot towards purchasing F-14s or F-15s or even Mirage 2000. Airborne early warning, they have the same types of options. And then within each of these options, the player has the ability to push the design start, to adjust the design length. They can change the building span, the same types of decisions that would be made by a stakeholder in the real world. And this allows them to kind of plan out their budget for their cycle so they don't have these gaps that exist.
So it's very detailed, and clearly you've done a huge amount of work on this. My sort of layperson take is that not only do we have a bit of a defense procurement force design, but we also have a bit of a force management readiness tool by the way we can close bases, move squadrons, and I assume this applies to the land and navy as well, so that we can effectively cost save in the near term, which might often be a tension between spending more on modernizing, to use the term, and then spending less on our operational budget. Is that something you wanted to explore as you run this as an actual activity?
Oh yeah, that's absolutely something that I think is relevant to explore, because you can make all kinds of assumptions about what you think is going to happen, and if you make a bad decision to close a base, then that could end up being a difficult scenario in which you're potentially operating from further out, and you better hope you invested in refueling. I left Army out of this at the onset because this is initially focused on command modern operations, but that capability can certainly be built in the future. Okay, no worries.
You chose a 5-year span for each of the sort of epochs or phases as you go through this. Why did you choose 5 years and not a sort of year by year playthrough?
I think it's important for the player to feel some of that institutional inertia that exists, where if a decision is made, they can't roll back that decision the following year, but they're forced to really commit to something and move forward with that. because it's not something that when we think about the histories on whatever procurement program you want to talk about, there's always going to be institutional inertia behind something, and you want to put the player in a somewhat plausibly realistic or challenging position where they can't completely wipe everything off the board and restart just because one thing changes.
Okay, that makes sense. And you mentioned that it's an alternative history of the Cold War. Again, uh, firstly, why did you choose that? And then secondly, how have you generated this alternative history? And is it one alternative history, or is there a branch of alternatives within that history?
So the first thought was considering the audience of Fight Club being mixed active duty and civilian with potential security concerns for using more modern equipment. Uh, it makes more sense to keep it constrained to the Cold War, where you have a lot of scenarios that could potentially play out similar to modern day, without any of that risk of somebody mistakenly saying something about modern equipment that might be in the scenario. As far as the alternative history goes, um, the way that this is designed is that it follows something of a railroad track with some branches, but it's more or less going to end up in the same direction. The alternative history overall is also contained in a book that's fairly lengthy. That was also one of the enjoyable parts of this, was just coming up with what feels like a plausible alternative history with some big geopolitical shifts. And what was the third question?
No, it was just two.
Okay.
And I think from a sort of data source side, you have all the Cold War platforms modeled and thoroughly researched, whereas futuristic stuff can be difficult to do and therefore could pose problems if you were trying to go from, for example, 2025 to 2030, 35, 40.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you think about just how much the war in Ukraine has shifted the reality around drones, that 10 years ago, I don't think that anyone would have thought of that. This allows us, and to your point also, this allows us to both have a wide database of capabilities, but also it plugs in well with the existing database within Command Modern Operations.
Yeah, so a good example there of playing to your system strengths rather than trying to effectively engineer on top.
Absolutely.
Okay, so you've got this 5-year force design and force management application. Does anything happen at the end of that 5-year period?
Yep. At the end of the 5-year period, there's a crisis draw. So this is a particular crisis that could erupt during this timeline, and the player needs to respond to it with the forces that are generally deployed in theater, as well as any ongoing changes to what's available. And then the intent is at the end of the 5-year, there will also be more of a conventional expected battle so that the player can consider both these unexpected scenarios and then that expected scenario, and they can judge how they did against both the unexpected and the expected.
Okay. And how is that simulated? Because we're obviously operating in your browser HTML based system here. How do we then move that to command?
Yep. So we move that to command. It goes into we have our crisis trigger. Actually, this is a mid-period development. Turkey has withdrawn from NATO, and then we'll draw our crisis, which is the Baltic Soviet exercise. Si Side note, I'll let you edit this out, but this was supposed to default to the Turkish invasion of Cyprus. um, Let me go back. Let me reset this
All right, you can
quick
fix the
here.
pathfinding later. No one will know.
Yeah. All right. We're going to go to the operational planner. Okay. So then the next step is that we go into this more of a theater mode, where there's a theater of operations and the player looks at what's available. They can make decisions. They can see what's available. So then what happens is the player looks at what's available. They can advance through. They can make changes to their deployment. They can do some of the basic things in kind of those 7 days before the conflict starts, and then the player exports it, and they can copy this right into the console of Command Modern Operations in the scenario editor, and this will build a turnkey scenario for them.
So very much they are going to be held accountable for the decisions they made in the epoch they've just done, but also in potentially previous epochs.
Yes, absolutely. Everything is additive over time. So they build something that's delivered in 1984 until they retire that equipment or mothball it or put it into reserve, then it will be available throughout the remainder of the scenario.
And is there an opposition side in the Cold War, being the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, also conducting this as part of a sort of AI background, or have you got a scripted sort of force development cycle for them too?
At the onset, this will be scripted, but it would not be difficult to set this up so that there was a UK version and a Soviet version and any other major power or ally on both sides. And it would be quite easy to scale this out to other countries.
And once they've played the scenario in command, what's the feedback loop to Road to War?
Yep, the feedback loop is that the player takes the log from command and they put it in that that's under development, but it's going to be something that any losses, expenditures are then incorporated back into the inputs for the beginning turn, whether it's 1985, 1990, so on and so forth.
So I could be wearing down my current fleet as I'm spending money to buy a future fleet of systems.
Yep, that's correct.
Okay. And is there an aspect of sort of equipment aging out and requiring more refits and all being unavailable for these scenarios or anything like that?
Yes, there is. So ships need to get their refits. There's maintenance cycling. It's not a perfect, everything's available all the time. It's intended to bring those kinds of real world constraints in, where older equipment is going to be less reliable. If there's been cuts to maintenance budgets, if there's been cuts to infrastructure, that is something that will impact the player in the scenario.
Okay, so above the technical layer, which we've talked about, how do you see this being run as an activity with one or more people involved?
Yeah, I think that this is something that is quite relevant to Fight Club. I think it helps to put the players in the shoes of what other decision makers are making, or decisions that decision makers are making, and lets them think about, what are the trade-offs that we need to be making? How can we try to apply this force design posturing in how we're using equipment when it's deployed? And overall, I think it could be a great professional workshop or microgame, as well as a longer campaign within Fight Club.
Sure. And internally, I can see that having a player looking after each of the domains or services would both share the burden of all that reviewing all that data and clicking all of the potential levers left and right, but it would allow for debate between land, air, sea, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure if you got space and cyber in this one, but regardless, the sort of the classic thing that you see in the newspapers of inter-service rivalry and positioning for money, and then potentially a purple player who gets to sort of have the final say, and then that way there is a sort of internal tension within the team as opposed to it being one person trying to play all of the services.
Yep, that's exactly the intent, is that it's supposed to try to simulate those types of conversations and those realities that exist in the real world of how do you coordinate, how do you make decisions that make the most sense instead of solely pushing for your branch's decisions. But overall, what is the trade? If you think back to historically, maybe some of the conversations in the UK around the fleet carrier debate in the early 1980s and preceding that really beginning in the 60s is what is the better approach? Is it carriers or is it more long-range aircraft from land-based equipment? And those are exactly the types of conversations that players are expected to be having in a scenario like this.
And does the overall money envelope from the government change, and how, and if so, how does it change?
It does change. So following, I'm not going to give any spoilers because I don't want players that might be doing research in the future to know what's going to happen. But there are changes based on geopolitics, both positive and negative, as well as changes in areas of operation. I think that's the most I'm going to say on that.
Okay. And you've shown us for this one is a very UK specific example, and I think there is a sort of human bandwidth issue here of trying to run the entire of NATO and the entire of the Warsaw Pact. So, do you see other nations coming on once you've done the development work?
I do, and I think I don't necessarily see this as one game with 25 or 30 different players, but it could very well be separated out and phased out or done in slices where one player might know generally or be there's I think there's a number of different ways that this could be done to try to simulate the progression over time, but I don't want to be too prescriptive on that at this point.
Sure. And I mean, with a 5 second export time lag, it's not going to be that much of an imposition to then compose effectively multiple national teams into a sort of coalition task force if you wanted to do that.
Oh, absolutely not. It would be quite easy to do something like that, and then you could also of course in that type of a scenario have the challenges of coordinating between forces, make hoping that everybody has if they everyone's specialized, hoping that everyone can make it to the fight.
Yeah. And then the ensuing arguments as people say that certain nations weren't pulling their weight, no doubt. I'm really excited for this, especially once you can get a sort of the equivalent mirror image on the red side, because often our perception of what they're doing and their perception of what we're doing are often culturally and heuristically biased, and potentially we're sort of mirror imaging ourselves as opposed to seeing what they're actually doing. And I could imagine that being quite a surprise when you jump into command and see that the thing that you thought to be fighting was not actually there and something else was there in its place.
Absolutely. That's part of the fun that I think players are going to have with this.
So what are the next steps for you to get this to some kind of beta, or I assume this is an alpha that you've got here, or you're already at beta, I don't know.
Yeah, I would say this is at alpha right now. I think there's some questions around. There's certainly some really good capabilities coming out with command modern operations in the future. Real-time multiplayer being one of them that could really enable something like this. But it's just a question of iterating through, making sure that everything is set up properly, that there's the appropriate level of depth for player options, particularly given that the Cold War doesn't end in this timeline, making sure that it doesn't kind of end in the historical timeline, but there are sufficient options for the player going forward into really into the 1995 cycle.
Interesting. So I guess there is almost another metagame aspect here. If your aim was to basically out make the Soviet Union outspend its own capacity so it collapses?
In this timeline, energy prices have a very different long-term trajectory, which extends the life of the Soviet Union through the end of the scenario.
Hmm. Yeah, I like the way we sort of return back to the sort of geopolitics from the pure military aspect. So yeah, lots to consider. Okay, if people wanted to um, use this, do they need to have any specific software other than the game system that we've talked about being Command Modern Operations?
No, they can. This is I have it private on GitHub, but this is something that could be shared and run locally by copying the repository to a computer.
Okay. And the ground plan is we're going to do a sort of closed beta inside of Fight Club, and then try and roll it out more broadly.
Yes, that's the plan.
Okay, great. Well, any final words for anyone who's watching this? Um, I would almost say as a sort of fan point is like, how did you get so interested in alternative Cold War timelines?
Yeah. I think it started. I've always been into command, even the older version. I think modern air naval warfare. I've been into this genre since Jane's Fleet Command, and I've always thought we kind of had the real Cold War, and I've always thought, we know that there was a lot of really cool, really different stuff that was going to be moving through the 1990s, and what would it look like if the Cold War didn't end? And how do you kind of think of a history or create a history that might make that more plausible and tie everything together? And I just kind of had fun with it and did it all really through AI was a force multiplier in this, just as far as being able to really go into the level of depth that was required for something like this.
Yeah, so I suppose therefore for you, the real value back you're getting is when players get to the 1990, 95, 2000, 2005 period. That's when you're really into the alternate because we're talking about a power that no longer existed in the real world and seeing what that could look like.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's very, very interesting to think about those alternative paths the world could have taken.
Great. Well, you've obviously done a huge amount of research and detail, which is always appreciated with these things. So best of luck getting it from alpha to beta. And I look forward to getting the closed beta testing set up in the club and then rolling it out in future. So Sam, thanks very much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you very much.